Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Think Out, the monthly debate series of the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. At the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we address societal challenges through interdisciplinary team research. We combine the latest in science and engineering with deep domain knowledge from social sciences, humanities, business, and the arts. In each Think Out, we bring together leading researchers from very different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss and debate an important question that the world is facing. So in a Think Out, we aim to dive deep into a complex issue, have fun, and engage you, the audience, to this open discussion between leading thinkers. So today's session is on climate change. And as we know, it is the study of the Earth's climate system. However, its focus is really broader than just environmental impact. It encompasses economic, social, environmental, and psychological issues that really need to be addressed to ensure that we combat climate change effectively. And today we address the question, how can we communicate climate change to young people to bring about awareness and behavioral change to meet the most important challenge of our time? And of course, there are many considerations, such as the psychological and emotional effects of climate science communication on young people. My name is Vanessa Evers, and today we have a bit of a change, this Think Out, because Hallam is on a sabbatical to James Cook University. So we have my colleague, Andrew Prohl, and together we will moderate this debate today. So over to you, Andrew, to introduce our experts for today's debate.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Yes, we are very lucky to have two experts with us today. The first one I'll introduce is Professor Benjamin Horton. He is the director of the Earth Observatory of Singapore and a professor at the Asian School of the Environment here at NTU. He's been appointed the AXA Nanyang Professor in Natural Hazards. His research concerns sea level change with the aim of understanding and integrating the external and internal mechanisms that have determined sea level changes in the past and which will shape such changes in the future. His research impacts upon important ecological, ethical, social, economic, and political problems specifically facing coastal regions. He's led the COP26 report on managing disaster risks and natural hazards in ASEAN, and he's also been appointed a mentor for the Commonwealth Futures Climate Research Cohort to guide a group of researchers working towards solutions for climate vulnerable communities in the lead up to COP26. He's a review editor for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, and was an author on the 5th Assessment Report. Recently here at NTU, he was appointed in 2019 the President's Chair in Earth Sciences at NTU for an outstanding achievement. And a couple interesting pieces of trivia is that in 2016, the Plinius Medal, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was awarded to Prof. Horton for outstanding research on the mechanisms and nature of past sea level changes. And probably the coolest piece of trivia here is that President Obama actually cited Prof. Horton's research in his 2015 State of the Union address at the U.S. Capitol. So thank you so much, Prof. Horton, for joining us today. And our second speaker our second expert joining us is Assistant Professor Ming Lee, who is at the National Institute of Education here in Singapore. She's a practicing clinician as well as a researcher, as she is a licensed psychologist in the United States and a registered psychologist here in Singapore. She specializes in child and adolescent mental health. Her research interests are in the areas of developmental psychopathology and psychiatric epidemiology. She has worked on research projects that study the emergence of psychopathology as well as the effectiveness of prevention programs to build resilience in youth within the multi-tier system of support the multi-tier system of support in schools here in Singapore. Another area of her interest is to study the pattern of mental health services utilization in Singapore, and she has researched extensively on the impacts of COVID-19 on youth mental health, the coping mechanisms resorted to, and assessing the effectiveness of social intervention measures. So thank you so much both for joining us here today. And at this point, I want to make sure that we get the poll question up, because we typically start with a poll question. So if we can get that up on the screen. Okay, So you, the audience, this is where you come in. First of all, take a crack at answering this poll question, because we're going to show it again at the end of the debate. And it's always interesting to see how answers may change or stay the same. The second thing, audience, that I'll really need your help with to make this a great debate is to use the Q&A function to ask questions to everybody, to ask questions, I should say, to our panelists specifically. Give feedback and ask follow-up questions if needed. We'll try and get to those questions during the debate. Please make sure to put your name and affiliation in your Q&A entry, just because we want to recognize your contribution. Okay, so that should pretty much do it for the poll, and we will now move on to our opening statements. Our first opening statement will come from Benjamin Morton, so I'm going to pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Vanessa, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I thought I'd give an opening address that would say something about my story. I've been studying climate change for nearly 30 years, and this has culminated with me becoming the director of the Earth Observatory of Singapore, which is a research centre of excellence here at NTU. There are only 6 nationally. This research centre basically aims to keep the lives of people here in Singapore and Southeast Asia safer and more sustainable. We look at fundamental research regarding geohazards, be they earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and more recently, as the attention of the Singaporean government has turned to looking at the impacts of climate change, and in particular sea level rise. So when I've said I spent 30 years studying climate change, what I've really done is looked at sea level. This began in my PhD research. When I was doing my PhD, my PhD was to look at how past sea level changes in Great Britain were controlled by climate change. I looked at a time period from the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago through to today. And I identified warming periods in the climate that caused rapid periods of sea level rise that eroded the coastlines of Great Britain and broke the land bridge that had existed between Great Britain and continental Europe. I then moved over to the United States once I'd completed my PhD, and I was based at the University of Pennsylvania. There, I looked at a much shorter time period of sea level and got more involved in the communication of climate science. My landing in the US coincided with the Inconvenient Truth movie produced by Al Gore, and that made climate change a topic of debate of every single American. And I found that my knowledge of understanding how sea level had changed in the past could be used to compare with how fast it was rising in the present. I produced a landmark publication which showed that the rates of sea level change in the 20th century were faster than any other time period in the previous 2,000 years. And it was this statement that President Obama used in his State of the Union address. The State of the Union address is only given once per year by a president, and it was very, very unusual for him to cite an individual group of scientists. Usually he relies upon information from NASA or NOAA or the United States Geological Survey. More recently, 5 years or so ago, I came over to Singapore because Singapore is at the center of research looking at climate change. Regarding sea level rise, it's anticipated by the end of this century, if we don't do anything about greenhouse gas emissions, that up to 1 billion people will be flooded by the rising seas. But this has an uneven geographical distribution. 70% of those 1 billion people will be in South or East Asia. So the research is critical. Research is critical here in Singapore. A third of our island is less than 5 meters above mean sea level. So if you take into account the extreme tides, you take into account the storm surge, you need a sea level rise less than 1 meter to cause devastating flooding effects to a third of this island. If we think more broadly, There are 16,000 islands on the marine archipelago of Southeast Asia. So this area is very, very susceptible to sea level rise. And we've also placed our people and our infrastructure and our critical ecosystems along the coast. As Andrew said, another aspect that illustrates perhaps my standing in climate science is that I was a author on the 5th assessment of the IPCC, and then was promoted to be an editor on the 6th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm just going to show you a slide now. So I hope you can see that slide. So this slide shows two of the take-home messages from the IPCC. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reviews climate science every 7 years. So we review thousands upon thousands of publications, taking hundreds of hours. I'd just like to note that we don't get paid for this. This is all about a group of scientists coming together to try and provide the state of the art on climate science for policymakers. The take-home message is that the scientific community shows that it is now unequivocal that humans have influenced our atmosphere, our oceans, and our land. And we see the widespread and the rapid changes in the atmosphere through the increases in greenhouse gas concentrations. The amounts of our greenhouse gases in 2021 is 50% higher than they were prior to the Industrial Revolution. Indeed, the last time they were this high was 3 million years ago. 3 million years ago, you had similar carbon dioxide concentrations. The temperature of our planet was 3 to 4 degrees C higher than today. If we just remember that figure of sea level rise for Singapore of 1 meter, what happened 3 million years ago? Sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than today. We see changes in precipitation. For every degree centigrade that you increase temperature, there's 7% more water vapor in our atmosphere. This is coming down on our land torrentially, causing widespread flooding and landslides. We also have rapid changes in our oceans. Sea levels are rising, ocean heat is increasing, and the acidity of our oceans is increasing. We have impacts on our cryosphere, the land-based ice. We've lost nearly 50% of the glaciers on our planet. Our ice caps are melting. Our sea ice is disappearing. And perhaps most importantly, the big, large ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are showing signs of destabilization. Every single person in Singapore and Southeast Asia and globally's fate is linked to the Antarctic ice sheet. The Antarctic ice sheet is quite simply colossal. It's twice the size of Australia. It's 20,000 times the size of Singapore. It's 3 kilometers thick. It has enough water within it to raise global sea levels by 65 meters. 65 meters. You melt a small percentage of that ice sheet, and the sovereign nation of Singapore does not exist, and every other coastal city is at risk. Then we can think about the biosphere. Climate scientists state that if we get our temperatures 2 degrees C above the pre-industrial, we're already at 1.1. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest ecosystem on our planet, has existed for 25 million years, will disappear. To do with land and ocean biodiversity, it is anticipated by the end of this century, if we don't mitigate against greenhouse gases, 1 in every other species, excuse me, will be subject to extinction. So climate change is the big problem. As society, we always are having to react to very, very disturbing events to do with Ukraine war. We're still in the midst of a pandemic. But climate change will not simply disappear. There is not a vaccine for climate change, but we do know the solutions. the scientific community has been communicating the impacts and the solutions for climate change for nearly 30 years. What we need now is action of our policymakers, of our businesses, of our governments, to provide the solutions so we can have a healthy planet. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Prof. Horton. And now we'll move on to our next expert, Ming Li. Professor Young, would you like to go with your opening statement, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Priya. And thanks to Dr. Horton too for sharing with us your life work and really telling us about the abundance of scientific information that is related to climate change and showing the sure certainty of climate change and the adverse physical and environmental effects. So decades ago, I think when scientists started to talk about climate change, most people were not personally experiencing the effects. The faraway abstract risk was generally undetectable by individuals. However, today, as Dr. Horton has showed us, almost everyone is experiencing climate change up close. Many experience climate change at a catastrophic level in terms of natural disasters like hurricane, wildfires, extreme heat, and flooding. Still, many more are experiencing the gradual, cumulative, and ongoing effects associated with environmental hazards and environmental degradation. So examples are air pollution, water pollution, high living density, loss of nature, increasing temperature, food insecurity, and even in Singapore, we are feeling the heat of climate change. Unrelenting urban heat and uncontrollable spread of infectious diseases like dengue. Our direct and personal experience of these outcomes is likely to make us more aware of climate change risks in our personal and daily lives, but provided that we rightly attribute them to climate change. Scientists can see how humans have set off a chain of cascading events leading to climate change. But the layperson may not be able to do that due to the complexity of the issue. So how are we going to help young people understand this complexity without blame and shame, and motivate them to take positive and effective actions to deal with the problem? So at this point, can I request my slide to be shown? Thank you so much. So I think scientists have been focused on the physical effects of climate change, as reviewed by Dr. Horton, but they have focused less on the complex and multi-layered social determinants of human behaviors. Communicating that human behaviors cause climate change is probably overly simplistic and unhelpful. We need to understand how context influence individual behavior. I am a psychologist, both a researcher and a clinician. My research is focused on youth mental health, stress, trauma, and coping, and more recently, the psychological impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to use our recent and ongoing experience of COVID-19 to illustrate how we can deal with climate change by better understanding the social and psychological aspects of this global problem. One of the lessons we learned from COVID is that consistent and unambiguous messaging that is aligned with actions is very important, because this can result in the creation of social norms that can support behavior change. Take the example of wearing masks and social distancing. We have one another to remind us what we need to do and when to do it. In other words, enforcing the prevailing social expectations of COVID time. Transparent and sincere communication can also help us assess our risk of COVID more accurately, make helpful appraisals about our own ability to cope, attribute responsibility fairly, and become accountable for our own actions. These psychological processes can enhance an individual's sense of control, and self-efficacy, motivating the person to take corrective actions. The second lesson that we have learned is that we need to address the contextual and structural factors that contributed to the infectious spread of COVID. For example, when we learned about how easily COVID spreads in cruise ships, at work, and in restaurants, we took a necessary timeout from those activities. Tough and unprecedented decisions require leadership at the structural levels. When leadership is provided, individuals and communities very quickly stepped up to take collective responsibility for the shared problem. The lesson is that structural changes are needed to support and motivate behavior change at the individual level. The third lesson that we learn is adapting to new stresses and challenges of COVID means accepting differences and accepting losses, moving forward and making transformational changes. For example, businesses pivoted to new economic opportunities, employees work in new ways, individuals explore new hobbies, interests, and life options. Responding to the pandemic in creative ways can increase resilience and psychological wellness for people. Overall, we need to understand the psychosocial mechanisms of behavior change, which necessarily include the contextual and structural entities, in order that we deal effectively with climate change. So I'll close my opening statement at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Ben, for your passionate message of truth about sea level rising. And thank you, Ming Li, for explaining the role of behavioral aspects and effects of something like climate trauma that hopefully we will get into a little bit more. I'd like to kick off with the first question before we go to the questions of the audience. And I'd like to invite the audience to really engage with us. Put your thoughts, your opinions in our Q&A. If you have a question, we address it. Feel free to give us a follow-up. We really would like to have a very lively engagement with you and pull you in as much as possible in such a virtual medium. So the question I wanted to head off with is that, we all know climate change is true. Okay, there might be some exceptions, but let's just, they also know climate change is true. Everybody knows that climate change is a real threat to humanity. I mean, it's going to end us. If we don't do anything, it's the whole party is over. Okay, there might be 20 people with Elon Musk on Mars, but otherwise it's all over. So we know this. When I was a kid, we knew this. When I was a young person, we knew this. We had the threat of nuclear war. As the thing was acid rain at the time, the ozone layer was disappearing at the time. And all of this was going to change the climate to the extent that life on Earth would disappear. And I remember feeling powerless and feeling helpless and not believing that I would have a future. And kids nowadays, they seem to be in an even worse situation. There is more awareness, more knowledge, but they don't see any change, and their powerlessness might even be bigger. So everybody knows what they need to do. I know what I need to do. I'm a little less powerless as I was when I was a kid. But we're all waiting for our policymakers. Ben, you mentioned it's really time for policymakers to step up, for leaders to step up. And we're kind of, I don't know, waiting for them to dictate to us, look, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're not going to fly anymore until we've got hydrogen fuel or something like that. We're wanting them to tell us what to do. And in the meantime, we do little things. We separate our plastics. We try not to waste water. We try to get solar panels on our houses. So what the hell's going on? And how can we keep perpetuating this from generation to generation? Yeah, feel free to dive in here, both of you.
Well, maybe I'll start the ball rolling, and you can look at climate change, or I always look at climate change at the moment as either a glass half full or a glass half empty. If I wake up on the wrong side of the bed and I'm not feeling very good about the state of the planet, which is very easy to do whenever you switch on your phone and you look at the front page. When you think about climate change, as you mentioned, Vanessa, when we were both at school, 30 years ago, climate change at that point was a bit of a success story, or the classes that I saw, because we had the scientific community making predictions on climate, and then all governments, US, who was in charge by Bush, UK in charge by Thatcher, so Republicans and Conservatives said that this was something that they would address. And so I thought it was quite uplifting that scientists and governments, didn't matter what side of the aisle you were from, were going to address this problem. And I thought, I want to be part of this. But what I saw, particularly when I moved to the US, is that climate change became very political, something as a scientist I could never really understand because it's basic physics. You know, you take an ice cube out of your freezer and put it at room temperature, what happens to it? It melts. And I always thought an iceberg doesn't really care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's gonna melt and sea level's gonna rise in your state. And I found it very, very frustrating. So that's the glass half empty, is that for 30 years, climate scientists have been predicting what we are experiencing right now. Right now, we have huge problems to do with food, irrespective of the Ukraine war. In Australia, the price of fresh vegetables has tripled this year because of the devastating floods that Queensland and New South Wales experienced. Right now, we have a health warming in Delhi because temperatures are going to top 46 degrees centigrade. We will get very extreme temperatures and we will get very, very extreme food prices here in Singapore with climate change. It's not a matter of if, it's just when, but we don't do anything about it. On the flip side of glass half full is the fact that we have a movement of the youth who are committed on climate change. If I turn to Australia again, the power of the individual got rid of an anti-climate government. In the US, Biden was elected, the highest number of people ever voting in a US election voted for President Obama, and that was built on social change. The youth came out in force and backed the Democrats that had the social policy that the youth believe in: equality, inclusivity, diversity, and justice. And climate is central to that. And also for a glass half full, and I get this every single day. I got it this morning, walking into the Earth Observatory of Singapore. There are young, smart people who will provide the answers to climate change. Our generation needs to give them the time. We need to give them the time so they can have a stable economy and a stable ecosystem so they can provide the solutions, and their generations will be safe and sustainable. Glass half full, glass half empty. Which side of the bed do I get out of? Okay.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, Ming, would you like to address the perspective for young people here?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to jump in and talk about, how our recent lessons in COVID actually can generalize and really be something to encourage them on in tackling global climate change. So we really want to kind of focus on educating our young people to understand the contextual and structural drivers of climate change, right? As my diagram has illustrated. And that include aspects of governance, macroeconomic policies, social public policies, social and cultural values. So all these higher levels kind of factors really interact with their own behaviors. So being able to understand these higher levels of determinants of climate change can help young people see that they can act at all these multiple levels. And these multiple levels need change in them to support the individual level behavior change. Importantly, understanding that can also help them identify barriers that are impeding climate change effort. So this is helping them to analyze a problem, a complex problem, in an independent way, to help them have a sense of control, over what they are experiencing. And as Dr. Holton has said, providing young people with opportunities to respond to climate change is very important. And again, it really gives them the sense of control and efficacy, which has psychological benefits. So really, I suppose I could put it that way, that it's our generation to provide that opportunities for young people. And when young people participate in groups and communities focused on positive action, we see the effects of autonomy, competence, and connectedness with others that can promote a motivation to change. On top of it, it helps with the development of social and cultural norms and the expectations for behavior change. And of course, we think about people who may think differently long time ago, but I hope that they are thinking more similarly now because of the personal experience of climate change. Even if viewpoints about climate change issues may differ, I think we can still focus on positive actions. So we can encourage and model patience with ambivalent feelings while still facilitating considerations of pros and cons, losses and gains, about the past and future, right? There needs to be a lot of reframing to identify common goals. And based on the social construction of meaning, craft a common narrative about the experience of climate change, which I think we are already doing. So I think one point that the scientists can come in is to monitor change and provide feedback about actions at different levels. Show concrete examples like what Dr. Holton has done about individual and community level coping, adjustment, adaptations, as well as strategies that have been successful in mitigating climate change. I think these are really important for psychological well-being and motivation for change. It really prevents existential fear, or mitigate feelings of existential fear, feelings of hopelessness, and more importantly, really spur people on to actions.
Thanks. I'll hand over to Andy for the next question.
Great. Yeah, these are great insights thus far. One question that came from the audience actually emerged out of when registering for this event. Some people had typed in some questions that were of interest to them, and a few of them I read through them, and a few of them I thought were really interesting and kind of coincide with a lot of what we're talking about here. Now, one of them I have to mention because it was actually the only thing that was slightly contrarian. And it basically said, hey, can you comment on the paucity of evidence for catastrophic climate change? And I said, well, I obviously this debate isn't about this. I mean, everybody here is on pretty much the same page. What struck me about this question is this word catastrophic, right? We actually do hear that word, I think, said a lot in terms of climate change, right? There's going to be this incredible event is going to happen. However, a lot of what we've heard thus far from our two speakers suggests that this is a slow process. Granted, of course, it's accelerating rapidly on a geologic timeline, so to speak. But these things don't really, only recently have they really become visible to us, like Dr. Yang has been saying. Only recently are young people getting direct firsthand experience, I think, with climate change, or at least this is now what they recognize to be the effects of climate change. So I think this is kind of interesting, and I guess I wanted to ask more about this idea of catastrophic climate change. What is, and this is kind of maybe a question for Prof. Horton, is this the right word to be using when talking about climate change? Should we be discussing it in a catastrophic way? I mean, obviously it has catastrophic consequences, but usually I think people think catastrophe and they think of an event, something, a plane crash or something, a distinct event, but this happens over a slow timeline. So is that part of what you think kind of has contributed to perhaps some of the difficulties that have come from messaging to the public about COVID-19. And then also for Dr. Young on this point, you've mentioned a couple of times now that, you know, when people get overwhelmingly negative information, they don't have a sense of control. They start to think about an existential crisis and existential threats. So also, what do you think about this phrasing that we oftentimes hear around climate change, is that it is catastrophic in a way? So I hope you can understand where I'm going with that, but I think that was just a really interesting question because of the use of that word, catastrophe.
There are so many levels to your question there. But as someone who studied climate change, particularly looking at the past, so the geological record, the past is the key to the future. We know tipping points or thresholds in the climate system that if you go beyond causes catastrophic changes. I mentioned just one of those in my address, the Antarctic ice sheet. We know, there's no debate about this. We know that if we increase our temperatures beyond 2 degrees C above pre-industrial values, we use the pre-industrial as our baseline. What was temperature in 1850? So if we go 2 degrees above that, we're already at 1.1. If you go 2 degrees above that, you cross thresholds for which there is no return, not on a human generational time span. So you go beyond 2 degrees C and the Antarctic ice sheet collapses, and that is catastrophic because it's got 65 meters of water within it. It's catastrophic for every single Singaporean because you lose a third of this island. And okay, we can go and build massive sea walls at huge cost, $100 billion. Where's that coming from? And if Indonesia got that type of money to protect their 16,000 islands, no, we know we're a global community. COVID taught us that. The Ukraine war has taught us that. Look at the price of petrol that we're paying now. So it's catastrophic. I know that these things happen really rapidly. The Earth doesn't change gradually. It meets thresholds and it shifts to a new equilibrium. In the geological past, the Antarctic ice sheet has always collapsed when it gets above 2 degrees C. Greenland ice sheet virtually completely disappears. About 2/3 of it goes. We know this as scientists. We've been able to track CO2 measurements on an annual basis. This is quite incredible, the data that we have. We have CO2 measurements on an annual basis going back 800,000 years. I always think, what more do policymakers need to have? It always staggers me because many of these policymakers are very, very smart people. They've been to university. Many of them have taken science and maths class. They understand the basics of physics. And you tell them all of this and they go, yeah, and they move on. You know, I had Hurricane Sandy. So I'll give you just an example of why things are catastrophic. So we did some work at the Earth Observatory of Singapore in collaboration with my colleagues in the US, looking at Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy barreled into New York City in 2012. Lots of lives were lost, $80 billion worth of damages. Manhattan lost electricity. So it was an incredibly catastrophic event. So we did some work on attribution. How did climate change influence that? Because you always get extreme events, but how did climate change? And quite simply, prior to the Industrial Revolution, an event of the magnitude of Hurricane Sandy occurred once every 500 years. Okay, or once every 7 generations. Because of the climate change from the 1850s to the present day, that event had decreased in its return interval, so it occurred once every 50 years. Let's look forward. By the middle of this century, an event of that magnitude is once every 5 years. At the end of this century, it's an annual event. That's catastrophic. Manhattan can't deal with that. So we had all this information and I went to meet Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, okay? very, very smart legal person. I think a good person. After the 9/11 attacks, he was the top legal analyst getting healthcare for the first responders. So he cared about people. I went to see him and said, look, this is the problem. We need to make the New Jersey shore more resilient because it's going to happen again and again and again. And he just looked at me and went, yeah, I fully understand that. But if I say that, I get voted out of office. Scientists have done their job. Increasingly so, we've dedicated hours, days, years studying this. It's incredible the information it has. It is incredible. We have a model that can project what the thresholds are that cause a catastrophe for the climate system. We couldn't predict a pandemic. We couldn't predict the Ukraine war, but we can predict climate change. And it's down to a broken political system that is holding us back. And the individual has the right to change the political system. They did in Australia, they did in America. Here in Singapore, climate change at the next elections has to be on every MP's ballot sheet. You have to ask them, what are they doing? Words are great. What are their actions? What is the action in your local community on climate change? Is your school trying to be carbon neutral? Have you been given any information to reduce your carbon footprint? Who you work for, do they have sustainable practices? They're the questions that the individual asks. And then we move as a global movement to solve this problem. It is a catastrophe if we don't act. Sorry, I got a bit emotional about that. There's certain things that click in my brain and I get really frustrated about certain periods in my past where I've got nowhere. I have been a very, very successful academic. That's why I'm sat here in this office. But I've been so unsuccessful at changing policy. I've just been a complete failure. I just haven't been able to move the needle at all. And that I find is one of my sort of big frustrations in my career. But it's not over yet, my career. It's not over yet.
Please don't apologize, Ben. I mean, what you are doing for us or trying to do for us is just truly amazing. And it's clear that it is a super frustrating situation. You're kind of standing there screaming in what seems to be a void. And then there are all these young people, all these young people that are also fighting for their future, just like you are. And Ming Li, I think it's very interesting, to bring up this Singapore context, because of course it's clear it requires some form of, dare I say the word, activism, some form of movement that fits within the Singaporean culture. The government provides a stable political climate which allows a younger generation to work out solutions for problems. I think that's definitely something that Singapore could offer. The relationship that children will have with this knowledge, with policymakers, with the government, how does that take shape? Do you have, and I'm also very aware that I am not, or by origin is Singaporean, so I don't have the subtleties and sensitivities within me, but what do you feel could be directions forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question and all those information. I think that, thinking about catastrophe, thinking from a psychological viewpoint, the word catastrophe does not, maybe have not matched many people's personal experience. So when they hear catastrophe, but they're not experiencing it, they could become desensitized at the individual level, right? That's what psychology tells us. So perhaps there have been a mismatch of the use of the word with the personal experience of climate change. So I think currently, and of course that affects people's perception of risk. So you say that it's a catastrophe, but I feel like I'm not experiencing it. So in that severity of the word, right? So and then it becomes like an abstract concept for many lay people. But we do expect the government people to understand it a little bit more. So, but I think at the individual level, that misalignment could cause communication problems, right? And so I'm proposing that for young people to be educated in the overall effects of climate change. So thinking about catastrophic events like natural disasters, as well as the gradual cumulative effects of climate change that they are experiencing, and helping them make causal attribution in that way. You know, I think through that understanding, I feel like we are more likely to get people to understand their roles in influencing their governments, and that their actions can be impactful at different levels of human society. So although it sounds like pretty complex kind of a model in thinking about behavior change, I think young people need to independently be taught that framework to understand what's going on in the world around them in relation to climate change.
So it is really awareness and knowledge, and then somewhere down the line there's the influencing policy, and there's such a big gap in between that. There's a question by Stephen Ang about the rejection of hope. I'm not sure if you have the chance to have a quick read through it, but it comes down to, you know, okay, giving kids a lot of information and having them awareness, having them understand what are behaviors that can make a change. But, you know, what if it takes so much time that there is a point where actually it's hopeless, and where is that point? And
you know, human beings are really good at adjusting and adapting to changes. So there's always hope, right? Of course, you know, we can't be too patient with change, but that's how people work. You know, we have to be comfortable with the ambivalence, and we have to work through it. That's how behavior change are effected, you know, are being implemented. So we need to provide the tools for young people to analyze the problem independently, and for them to show that motivation for change. And at the same time, we need to provide opportunities to create communities and groups, because that's how human works. We work in groups. We are motivated by culture and social norms.
Right, so you're arguing for like a new kind of self-efficacy related to around this.
Right, that is based on connectedness with the people around us. Nobody can stand on their own, right? And I think that's also related to what Ben talked about, advocacy, you know, and reaching out to the government and showing their decisions in polls. So it's kind of a, you know, there's good things about group and bad things about group. But, you know, I think this is something that we need to recognize in human society.
I thought I would just perhaps add to this, and looking at the questions about hope. The one thing, you know, again, I will just go back to what an amazing job the scientific community does on climate change. You know, people are always thinking that we do it because we get paid for it. You know, as I said, when I worked on the IPCC, I must have spent, I don't know, over 4 years, probably 400 to 500 hours on a variety of Zoom calls. I wasn't paid a single cent for that. I do it because I believe in what science is and that we can provide the answers. The scientific community have told policymakers that we have until the end of this decade to peak our carbon dioxide emissions. We stated this in 2018. Every policymaker, every government knows this. So that's your timeline on hope. If your government, let's say the Singaporean government, so pick up the Straits Times today. Singapore to tap R&D, private funding to reach net emissions by 2050. Do you think that's good enough?
Too late.
Too late. We need a better roadmap. It's great to get to net zero by 2050, but what I want to see is what I've been talking about. Because saying net zero by 2050, there's a lot of arm waving about that. It's a lot about carbon capture and storage. Take carbon out of the atmosphere, store it back underground. That's feasible, but has not been developed at a large scale. And that's what a lot of COP26 was. All these governments agreed, yeah, we'll get net neutral because we'll store the carbon. Wash our hands of it. What I want to see from the Singaporean government is how over the next 7.5 years, that's all we have, how Singapore will peak its carbon emissions. And this is all about information. Some of the stuff that Ming Lee said is that, can we have a carbon tracker? You know, can on the Straits Times, just like we look at the FTE index, can we have, what is the carbon production of Singapore? It's very easy to calculate if given the information. I'd like to see this at NTU. I'd like to see NTU have a carbon tracker to monitor how much carbon we are using and how do we implement a variety of energy saving measures to reduce it. You then can have that in your home or in your community. What an amazing thing it would be at a school to know how much carbon. Then perhaps they have a program where they plant trees around their school and it reduces the amount of carbon. What an educational tool that is. Then we start to see if we're making progress. One of our problems is it's quite hard. The scientific community can get scientific data. We know now that temperatures in 2021 are higher than they've been for probably at least 7,000 years. We know that sea levels are higher than they have been for 120,000 years. We know that carbon dioxide are the highest they've been for 3 billion years. I know all of that, and we've known that, and it goes through peer review. But what I don't know, very hot in real time, is how much carbon we used in Singapore this year or yesterday. And that's the information we need. And then we can start to control it. And that's what I mean. We have till the end of this decade. So there's plenty of hope if we do the right thing, because although there are some irreversible impacts of climate change, it's how fast it goes that makes the difference. And then if we do develop carbon capture and storage, we can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. We keep ourselves well below that 2 degrees thresholds. And that's such a huge success for everyone on the planet. And there are so many value-added benefits, you know.
Thanks, Ben. That's a really clear message. Let us all bond together on this message. Andy, I'm going to hand over to you for a final question, and we can put up the poll question again as well to see if people feel the same about the question that we had before. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks. This has been a great debate so far. So it's hard to pick a final question, but an audience member here, Mark Teo, asked basically, what is the threshold for communication to the public that will kind of get this younger generation to sort of tip into tangible action on climate change? And I think we've heard a lot of sort of suggestions thus far. There's so much information that we've heard during this debate from both of our panelists about what is, you know, critical information about climate change. But I guess the way that I read this question is, rather than reading what is the threshold for communication to the public, it's what do you think is the most important piece of information that we can communicate to the public? And I'm talking like, this is a 30-second elevator pitch to every layperson out there or every young person out there. 30 seconds in a lift going from level 1 to level 30, and you got to tell them something about climate change. Yeah.
Prime Minister to yourself for 3
Yeah. What would you say? I'm curious to get that young person to take tangible action, and I am just kind of curious.
Yeah, I also think this links back to Padamek's question, because the information can be interpreted in so many different ways, positive, negative. So this is a great question.
So as a psychologist, I would, show the levels of determinants of behaviors, and I would ask the young people, what are the things you think you can do at different levels? And they are going to provide me with the answers.
Well, I would hope that I'm speaking to somebody who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Singapore. So, I mean, I think the message is quite simple from the climate community, that the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, every single person on this planet will be influenced by climate change in the next few decades. If we don't stop climate change, it will be catastrophic. I'm not going to mince my words on this at all. If you knew, I mean, if you want to go on about that, if you knew what I knew about climate, you would be very, very scared.
Thank you, Ben.
Seriously.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ming Li. First of all, I feel like we should know everything about climate change. The fact that we only know 5% of it says more than enough. So thank you so much for this message. I really hope that our Think Out today is contributing to people thinking about how can we empower young people? How can we make sure that young people get the time, get the power to be able to find the solutions. So we have to do everything in our power to support them, give them as much power as we can, give them all the conditions in place so they can succeed. And that message is really clear from both of you. It means that we all have to really step up and face that music. And we could go on for many hours. This is a very worthwhile topic. We've only scratched the surface of it, but it does bring us to the end of our Think Out debate today. And many, many thanks to Benjamin Horton, widely published expert in sea level research and the effects of climate change, and Ming Li, specializes in developmental psychopathology and psychiatric epidemiology. Here is the poll question. Please do have a look whether your thoughts have changed, how you feel about our poll question. As you know, when we started I'll wait until people are finished before I say what we had at the beginning. Audience, we'd like to thank you so much for your participation. Please follow us on social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, to learn more, not about this debate series only, but also the research papers that are relevant from today's experts, information on both of today's speakers. If you want to know more, we will put up a lot of links there so you can educate yourself further and learn more about this important topic. As you can see, we had 93% of people feeling that they're pretty good at influencing other people, and that has moved to a little bit less. So I think we've all got a little bit more awareness that we have to do more to not only influence other people, but create the conditions for young people, to save the planet, since we are not doing enough yet. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Andy, for your co-moderation, and we look forward to you all joining us in our future Think Out session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.